In the shadows of our perfect home, I discovered a betrayal that shattered my soul. My beautiful wife, the love of my life, entwined with another man, tearing apart the very fabric of our vows. I burst into the room, my heart pounding with rage and disbelief, catching them in the act. Confrontation ignited like wildfire, emotions raw and unforgiving. Revenge became my only solace, tracking down her lover in the dead of night. A final, brutal showdown ensued, leaving me consumed by a dark satisfaction as the flames of vengeance danced in the background. This is my story, a tale of love turned to ashes. Tim met Jenny's family. The police suggested they stay protected, but Tim said no and came up with his own idea. Later, people found out that Tim was linked to the missing drug lords from his hometown. So Jenny and her family agreed to follow Tim's plan. Then the bad guys launched one last attack on Tim and Jenny. Jenny finally got her payback by killing her husband. Tim had his revenge on JW and said, "You will scream, you will beg, you will cry, you will wish for death, and I will keep you alive as long as I can. Now it's time to deal with the rest of them, one by one." The ringing phone woke everyone at 6:30 a.m. Tim was nearest, so he answered it. Jenny walked in and sat on her dad's bed, watching Tim's face go from sleepy to worried and then to angry as he listened for a long 20 seconds. He took 5 slow breaths and turned back to the call. "Sorry about that, Jim. What's going on?" He listened for a few minutes, turning red with anger. "Don't give me that nonsense. I trusted you. I trusted the Texas Rangers. You messed up a simple job. What's about to happen next is on you all. I'll track them down and I'm coming for them with hell on my heels. You had your chance and you failed. Now just stay in Austin. Let the news tell you what happens next. And don't say a word to your higher-ups. Some of them are dirty and we have it on tape." With that, he slammed down the phone and walked to the coffee pot. After pouring himself a cup of coffee, he looked out the window, then picked up the phone again to call Nate. "I want a meeting in an hour. Tell Jesse and Jose to bring the 3 prisoners. I only want you 3, Daniel, Chewy, and Chivo. This is serious." He turned to Jenny and Joe. "Karen and my boys were taken last night. It looks like it was from the inside, and the people in charge don't have a clue. I'll be heading north today after the meeting and questioning. This could get really messy, so it might be best for you to go back to San Antonio. They could come after Jenny, Joe. Take what you need and get ready." Jenny was in shock. She quickly hugged Tim and said, "Oh my God, not your sons. How could this happen?" "They have no good explanation. A ranger was in charge and 2 local deputies were supposed to guard them. All we know is that when the shift change happened at 2 a.m., by 6 a.m., no one was answering calls. They found her parents tied up in the safe house. The ranger isn't answering either. My guess is the ranger, the deputies, and maybe more are involved. My family is being held to keep us quiet about the dirty work that's been going on." "Tim, calm down," Jenny said. "There must be a way to fix this." Tim called his friend in New Braunfels and quickly explained the situation. "I'll need help," he said. His friend agreed to gather some people in the area. Jenny was pacing, worried. Joe was busy packing, telling Jenny to do the same. She hugged him again and rushed to the bedroom. Tim called Deputy Jackson. After a few minutes, Jackson called back. Tim shared his story and asked for help. Jackson said he would take a couple of days off after his shift to assist and spend the day gathering information. Nate arrived early, followed by 3 cars. Everyone was there, including Sheriff Rodriguez. Tim looked at Nate and then at the sheriff. "You probably shouldn't be here." "I don't see any sheriff," said Sheriff Miguel with a grin, looking around. "I'm only here to fish." Tim waved him over and they hugged. "These people can't do anything right," Tim said firmly. They all entered the cabin, grabbed the coffee that Jenny prepared, and sat around the table. "Where are they?" Tim asked with a worried look. "They are somewhere safe," Nate replied calmly. "Let's talk this through and then ask for their help." "I've been on the phone all morning," began Miguel. "I found out some things that might help." He shared the information from different sources, including Jim Boyd, who he mentioned was embarrassed and taking leave to come for the fishing tournament. Anyone willing to fish needs to understand the rules. If they can't follow those rules, they should stay away. "What are the rules?" Nate asked. "Everyone involved in this dies. No mercy." The group exchanged glances and nodded. "Sounds good," one of them added. But let's add something. Your family lives and we take out the bad guys, then we can all be happy back home. Tim smiled. Thank you. I need to mention that this detail has been part of all the plans before, so it must be included in this one too. Now, can we go ask the prisoners for help? Joe came over, shook Tim's hand quickly, hugged him tightly, and promised to keep Jeannie safe. He said he would be there if needed. Jeannie looked serious, but her lips shook as she held him. She kissed him like it was their last goodbye, then turned and walked to her dad's truck with her suitcase. The next place was at the pit where the others were buried. 3 metal lifts were set up, with a bandito hanging over a small fire. Nearby, there was a pile of mesquite branches. Chivo walked up to them, smiling as he showed his knife. Which one should I take? I can't cook all 3, he joked. I need some fun too. 30 minutes later, they had everything ready. The drug gangs keep their information hidden. But these guys are too foolish and full of themselves, Miguel said. Or maybe they think we won't chase them on Lake Travis. They aren't afraid. But that could be a big mistake. Maybe they really are that foolish. They rely on their bosses to protect them like before. Nate jumped in. These guys are definitely foolish. But are their protectors really this dumb, or is this a trap? I don't care either way, Tim replied coldly. I'm going after them, and anyone who gets in the way will pay. They used a backhoe to bury the remains in the same pit. They put dirt and plants over the grave and tossed rocks carelessly around. There were no signs of digging or of what was buried. Daniel said he would fix it up later, and by tomorrow it would look like part of the field. Back at the house, Miguel called Boyd on a private line. They talked for a bit, sharing news and updates. Then Miguel gave the phone to Tim. Tim tried to apologize again, but Kelly cut him off, saying nothing would be forgiven until his family was safe. If you really plan to help, get in touch with Randy Jackson. My friend Will is coming up with some buddies from New Braunfels, so you guys can join the fishing tournament. I'll give you his number soon. But Jim, listen, if anyone stands in my way or if there's a spy, they will regret it, he warned. He returned the phone to Miguel and they talked a while longer. Tim and the others wrapped up their final plans. By 3:30, everything was loaded and ready to go. They made a few changes to the plan based on new information and left at 3:55 p.m. About 30 miles later, they saw a military convoy on its way to drills. Nate wondered aloud which group had better weapons. They met up on a ranch near Henley, west of Dripping Springs. The landowner was from Houston, and the ranch hand living there was Daniel Mendez Jr. Boyd told them that Gomez, the leader of the Devil's Angels, was in charge of security at the lake house near Spicewood. He was there with 10 men. Karen and her sons were there too, along with at least 5 other women, 2 of whom were with the Assistant Attorney General and the Railroad Commissioner. He didn't know the identities of the other 3, but 2 high school seniors had been reported missing 2 days ago. Randy Jackson was scouting the area and would fill them in when they met near the Railroad Commissioner's lake house. Everyone put on camouflage boots and painted their faces with black smudge. They had 2 sniper rifles with noise silencers from a gunsmith in Marble Falls. They also had 2 automatic shotguns, a bazooka, and a grenade launcher. The last 3 would only be used if things went wrong, but they wanted them close by just in case. They met Jackson on a ranch road about a mile from the large lake house. He had been a Marine sniper, and Miguel was his Army counterpart. Now it was their turn to lead. After Jackson updated them, they made a few changes to the plan and parked the 2 vans in the bushes away from the road. They squeezed into 2 seats in the back of the pickup and drove toward the house with the lights off. The night was dark, but the road was paved, and there were white rocks along the side, so it wasn't too hard to see. They dropped 2 groups of 3 at spots chosen by Jackson to circle around the lake house. The rest of the teams went a quarter-mile further up the hill, turned off the main road onto a pasture road, and parked the truck. Miguel went right with a sniper rifle, while Randy Jackson went left with the other. They wanted their lines of fire to cross so they could cover more area. The distance was easy for them, but they had to take out as many guards as they could as quickly as possible, so waiting for the right moment was just as important as being accurate. Tim, Nate, and the older and younger Mendez moved up the hill quietly, spread out, and used binoculars to find the people inside. The 8 guards outside were not hard to spot. They were well armed with AK-47s, but were careless and undisciplined. They wandered along the stone patio, stopping to chat with each other. Jackson had one sniper rifle and Miguel had the other. They made sure their lines of fire crossed in front of them. Their shots would signal the others to rush out from the bushes across the open area near the stone patio and into the house. The attack would come from the front as well as from the sides. The snipers stayed hidden for a few minutes to help their team. 10 men planned to enter a house on the cliffs by the lake. There was no way in or out to the east. 2 guards talked on the southwest corner, and 2 others stood on the northwest corner when the snipers fired. They heard 2 soft sounds, one from each side. The gun fired once, and the bullet hit the target, making a second sound. The 4 guards fell to the ground. The other guards were walking around when more shots took them down. 3 teams ran across the open area from different sides. They checked the guards and moved over to the patio of the house. They looked through the windows and signaled to each other about how many people they saw inside. There were 6 people on the first floor, all in the living room at the back of the house. Tim noticed 2 girls he didn't recognize. The girls and 4 men were undressed and standing near the bar. Tim went in through the front door. Jesse's team came in from the south, and Jim Boyd's team entered from the north through the patio doors. Tim signaled for Jim's team to watch the stairs while his team moved quickly from the entry hall to the bar. They got closer to the 4 men while Jesse's team moved behind the 2 girls. They aimed their guns at the naked people. The men could see Jesse's team, and the girls could see Tim's. Tim quietly said, "If you scream or make any noise, you will regret it. Do you understand?" They nodded, and he added, "I'm here to find my wife and 2 sons. Where are they?" No one answered. Tim reached behind his neck and pulled out his short sword. He held the blade under the neck of one man who was frozen in place, with Tim's gun still pointed at him. "You have 10 seconds to tell me or you won't speak again. 9, 8. The man said, "They are upstairs." "Upstairs, where exactly?" Tim asked. The man turned his head a little and said, "Kelly." He laughed and added, "You have no idea what you're in for. Let us go and we'll give you the kids. But your wife stays. I doubt you care." Tim replied, "Hello, Sheriff. Fancy meeting you here. Why am I in over my head? It looks like we are in control here." The sheriff laughed. "You don't know who you're dealing with. If you survive tonight, we will find you and everyone you care about. We are more powerful than you think." Tim then slashed the throat of the man in front of him and backhanded the sheriff so hard that it broke his jaw. The sheriff fell to his knees, panic filling his eyes as blood poured out of his mouth. Tim stood over him, stabbed the sword into his neck and twisted it. The sheriff fell over, dead. "We are not doing anything because you're finished, Sheriff," Tim said, then turned to the others with his bloodied sword pointed at one of the girls. "Tell me what I want to know, or I will finish you too." 9, 8. She dropped to her knees and cried, "Please don't kill me. The boys are locked in a small bedroom upstairs. At the end of the hall, turn left. It's all the way down. The blonde girl and the 2 others are with the men in the big bedroom with a glass wall looking out at the lake." Tim looked at the other girl. "How many men are there?" "I think 6, but maybe 9. I didn't see them all. We were with the commissioner and the sheriff." She pointed to a man near Tim. "The commissioner knows. Ask him." Tim turned to the commissioner and pressed his sword against his nose, demanding answers. The commissioner tried to negotiate. "We need to talk about this." Tim pushed the sword into his nose, slicing it. "No deals. Speak or die." The commissioner clutched his face, preparing to scream, but Tim's teammate knocked him out. Tim then turned to the final man who had been silent. "Your turn," Tim said calmly. The man replied, "There are 2 guards with big guns and 8 others. One is the assistant attorney general, one is a Texas Ranger, one is a deputy sheriff, and one is a leader of a cartel. Be careful if you still plan to get your family." Tim pretended to be scared. "Is it the Los Angeles Del Diablo cartel you're talking about?" "Yes. Manuel Gomez and his brother are both up there." The man said, "I have no idea who the women are, but they have stopped screaming, so they might be alive or not. The Gomez brothers are dangerous, but Speth is even worse." "Who are you?" Tim asked. "Someone you don't want to mess with," the man answered. Tim nodded, and his teammate shot him. "Okay, I won't mess with you," Tim said, watching the body fall. "Now, girls, you see what could happen. The commissioner would be dead too, but he knows more about the people behind this trade than we've learned yet." You do too. We were going to check on you and then go upstairs to talk to the men there. You were supposed to lie still, be quiet, and wait for us to come back. If we heard even a peep from you, there would be trouble. Miguel and Randy walked through the front door, alert and carrying 2 shotguns. They nodded at each other. Jesse told them what had happened, and everyone followed them upstairs. They didn't see any guards as they walked down the hall, but they could hear voices from a bedroom on the right. Tim nodded at Chivo, who moved forward with throwing knives in his hands. The rest of the team spread out into doorways and rooms on both sides. That was fine. Chivo called out when he was close to the 2 men looking into the open doorway. The men stepped back and tried to close the door a little. Chivo threw both knives underhand, and each one hit a guard in the throat. The guards fell onto the carpet. The noise of their guns hitting the floor was soft because of the thick carpet, but Tim and the team rushed to the doorway in case anything changed inside the room. They pulled the guards away from the door and took their positions around it. Tim raised his hand. He, Nate, and Daniel Jr. went left down the hall into his son's room, guns ready. The boys were alone, sleeping together in a big bed. Tim sighed with relief, then stepped back and told Nate and Daniel to look after his boys. They promised to protect them like they were their own. Tim heard the door lock behind him. Miguel and Randy stood at the master bedroom door, shotguns ready, waiting for Tim's orders. He slowly opened the door and peeked inside. Katie was in the middle of a big bed, crying. There were 2 young women on either side of her. They were in trouble, and a man was hurting them. Katie was lying over a pillow, and a small man was hitting her while holding her head up with something. She looked pale and didn't make a sound. The Gomez brothers watched from the window and talked in Spanish. 2 other men stood against the wall watching. One held a video camera, filming what was happening on the bed. Everyone in the room was unclothed. Tim counted how many men there were and where they were located. He opened the door wider, leading his team into the room. He left the Gomez brothers and the other men with the shotguns and rifles and quickly dealt with the closest man with a knife. The second man with a knife tried to back up, but Tim got him too. The man screamed and fell back, bleeding. The Gomez brothers raised their hands in surrender. One of the men by the wall tried to grab a gun from a chair, but Randy shot him before he could reach it. Chewy took the camera from another man and told him to face the wall, raising his hands above his head. Tim turned to the man behind Katie and saw that he was still hurting her. Tim moved closer, and the man saw him and tried to run. He cowered against the headboard. The 2 other men who had been hurting the young women also tried to get away, and the one nearest to the door tried to grab a gun from the bedpost. Ranger Boyd stepped toward him, holding his gun steady, and said, "Go ahead, try it. I'll shoot you and watch you suffer." The man sat back on the bed and raised his hands. Boyd took his gun and pointed it at the man's belly. Katie slumped forward, and Tim could see that she was lifeless. He checked her pulse anyway. He gently kissed her cheek and covered her with a sheet. He spoke softly to the 2 young girls. "Wrap yourselves in the blankets and go sit in the corner. We'll help you soon. But right now, we need to deal with these men. Do you understand?" Both girls nodded, took the blankets, and hurried to the corner behind Randy. Tim felt anger building inside him. The small man saw the fury in Tim's eyes and began to panic. "Do you know who I am?" he stammered. "I'm the Assistant Attorney General of Texas. You are in big trouble." Tim's crew laughed hard at him. Tim smiled a dangerous smile and asked, "Do you know who I am?" The man shook his head. "Let me introduce myself. I am Karma. I am the one sent to punish you. I am your worst nightmare." The man's face turned to fear, and he tried to hide under the sheets. Tim threatened him with the sword slightly, enough to make him bleed. Boyd pulled the man off the bed by his hair until he was on his knees. Boyd kicked him hard in the stomach. The man fell forward, and Boyd slammed his head down so that it hit the floor, but his bottom was still in the air. Boyd kicked him again. The man screamed and got sick. Boyd put his foot on the man's head, pressing his face into the vomit. He turned to the crew. "Let me introduce you to the Texas Ranger who protects Tim's wife and their son. Over there on the bed is the deputy sheriff who was supposed to keep them safe. His name is Don." He gestured to the 2 men with his gun. He asked which one of them wanted to tell him where the other officer was. Neither spoke up. Tim pointed at Chivo, who walked over to the ranger and cut off his ear with a quick move. The man, Jones, tried to scream, but the sound went away when Boyd stomped on his face. Chivo moved toward Deputy Lang, who raised his hand to stop him. Lang shouted that he wouldn't help them, but they had already killed his friend. They tossed the body in a creek near Taylor. He didn't want to do it. He wasn't the one who killed him. Tim jumped in. But you let Long kill Jones, your partner. You're Long's partner in the kidnapping, aren't you? You are the one hurting this woman, right? Gentlemen, please vote. The group loudly said he was guilty. Tim nodded at Will and Guillermo. They were ordered to find out what else he knew and then to carry out his punishment. Chivo had a wild grin as he pushed the man out of the room. The man's muffled screams lasted less than 10 minutes before they fell silent. Randy watched over the cameraman. Tim, Daniel, Chewy, and Jesse stood around the Gomez brothers, known for being fierce leaders in a drug cartel. The Gomez brothers looked terrified, and one of them had wet himself. The glass on the floor was a mess. The scared men pressed against the glass, and Manuel tried to bargain, offering millions of dollars to be set free. Chewy quickly flicked his knife and made a cut on Manuel's chest. The screams stopped soon after. Chewy said, "You won't be safe, but you might survive. It depends on how angry El Rey de Los is. Teo, how angry are you?" Tim told them to take the Gomez brothers downstairs to Chivo for more torture. He wanted them to remember every girl they had harmed. This included his niece, and he suggested they carve her name into their skin if they wished. Tim said this coldly, a small smile on his face. "Before you go downstairs, let them know what happened to the men they sent and what will happen to their families. They should know that their little empire is gone and that their parents, wives, and children will be dead in a week." He turned to the Gomez brothers. They both begged him to save their families, claiming they had done nothing wrong. Tim smiled cruelly. "My sons were innocent too. Did that stop you from kidnapping them or planning to kill them? Did being innocent stop you from hurting many girls, stealing them and making them slaves? Did being good help my wife when you brought this monster here? No, you will die, and your children will die too. Everyone connected to you by blood or marriage will die. Many people will die, but not as many as you've harmed. That is your legacy, to die with no one remembering you or caring about you." He signaled to have them taken away. As they were pushed out, they cried and begged, which didn't match their tough reputation as criminals. Tim laughed. "What a joke. A bunch of bullies picking on girls. By the time they die, they'll regret every choice that brought them here." He ordered Miguel and Jose to take another man downstairs and question him properly. "We need to know who he is, his role, and what he knows. Don't let him die before we find out." Tim then said to Randy, Jim, and himself, "We'll question the three men here." He noticed one man was still facing the wall, his hands up. Randy watched a scared man on the bed. "If he tries to escape, shoot his leg, but don't kill him. I want to finish him myself, but that will happen later." Tim slipped his knife against the man's back. "As I count down from 10, you'll tell us who you are and what you know about this situation. You better give us good information or I'll make this knife go where it shouldn't when I reach 0. He started counting. 10, 9. The man lost control and started talking. "I'm Adam Ballard, the Chief of Staff for General Spaeth. I can give you names of people who have taken part in these activities and covered them up. I know where we hid the videos we've made over the years. I'm a gold mine of information." Tim looked at Ranger Boyd and Deputy Sheriff Jackson, both surprised. "Looks like we hit the jackpot, guys. Randy, take Mr. Ballard downstairs to the kitchen table, get him some water, and record what he says. If he's holding back, take a finger, then a toe. Keep going until he's honest." Tim turned to the women. "Girls, go with Deputy Jackson. He'll find you clothes and make sure you're comfortable. Randy, put the girls in a room away from all this, but they can't leave until we talk." He looked at the others. "The guys from Spaeth and Landon can have water and a bathroom break, but keep them scared and naked for now. I haven't decided what to do with them yet. Girls, you saw how ruthless we are. I'm sorry, but I can't assist with that." The sadness turned back into anger and a strong need for revenge. Spaeth and the others would pay badly for what they did. Spaeth was lying on his stomach. Someone was sitting on his back, pressing his head into a wet pillow. He was hitting his ribs and sides hard. Wayne and Jesse were holding his left foot, which had a nail stuck in the heel. There was another nail in the right heel. Speth screamed in pain, begging them to stop, but the pillow made it hard to hear him. Wayne got off when he saw Tim. His arms were tied to the bed frame, just like you said. What do we do now? Raise his hips and put a big pillow under him, Tim ordered, and tie his feet to the bed corners. Tim removed the rubber from a plunger he brought from the bathroom. He pushed it slowly into Speth, making him scream even louder. How many women and girls have you hurt? What happens next is something your tiny tool could never do. I want you to suffer for your whole life, just like Karen did when you killed her. Then he began pushing the plunger handle up into him. Speth screamed and fainted. Wayne poured cold water on him, waking him up to more screaming. Tim put a clear plastic bag over his head and taped it tight around his neck. They watched as Speth struggled and had trouble breathing. Tim cut a hole in the bag just before Speth passed out. He gasped for air, trying to scream again. We will cover the hole with tape. They watched him panic again as he fought for breath. They pulled the tape off and he gasped like a fish out of water. Tim bent close to his sweaty face. Do you want to live or do you want to die quickly? We can keep this up all night. Are you ready to answer our questions? Speth nodded quickly and said yes with a shaky voice. Your chief of staff says he knows where the video and audio tapes are, so we don't really need you. But maybe you can help us by telling us what else you have that could get others in trouble. I have a whole box of photos of rich and powerful people with underage girls and boys, politicians from local, state, and even national levels. I can get them for you. Just let me live. As a sign of good faith, tell us where they are and how you will get them to us. Now, if I tell you, I know you will kill me, but I'll take you there, he bargained. In less than 30 minutes, you'll have maps and keys, Tim said softly, because you act tough, but you are really a coward. The pain I'm about to give you will seem small compared to what I've already done. Do you really want that? Just give us what we need and the pain will stop. It didn't take 30 minutes. The sound of the drill made it clear he couldn't take any more. They got all the information they needed, and before long he was crushed just like he did to Karen. He died weak and broken. But Tim was still angry and not satisfied. Other bad men needed to pay, and his thirst for revenge was strong. Downstairs, Tim found one woman dead and another barely alive. Chievo was trying to help her. They were deeper in trouble than he thought. Tim explained that they were working for Speth and Landon. They had drugged and kidnapped girls and sold them to Manuel Gomez. After watching Chievo, they talked too. We have more information and proof than we can use in court. We have names of some of the kidnapped young people, but it's only a small number. We can probably solve many missing persons cases of young people in Texas from the past few years. We know where the films and tapes are and have the vault code. The list of people involved will change Texas politics for years, but we'll have to be careful since many powerful people are involved. I assume Smith gave you more. Want to share with us? Not right now. Jesse has the tape. You can look at it later, but this goes back several years with many familiar names involved. He had a box of photos, and he thought he was safe because of it. Unless you need something else, we should start making arrangements. Where are the girls? Tim was directed to the guest room behind the stairs. He sat with the two young girls and talked for 15 minutes while the others worked on their plan. When he came out, he told Daniel Sr. to get his son, Nate, and Tim's boys. He had Randy take the girls outside and down the road a little. Tim carried his wife's body down to a boat dock on the lake, laying her gently on a seat. He uncovered her face to speak to her one last time. Then he backed the boat away from the dock, tied the steering wheel, and let it drift toward a deserted beach about half a mile away. He said a final prayer for Karen and walked back up the hill. He joined the others a little way down the road. His boys were still asleep, while Nate and Tim led the girls over 2 hills into a deep ravine behind the second hill. The girls set up a small camp with blankets against a limestone cliff on the east side. They sat down, still holding the sleeping child they were looking after. Nate quietly reminded them about what would happen next and how to speak to the police and firefighters who would arrive first. Tim kissed each of his sons on the cheek and each girl on the forehead. He asked the girls to go over the plan again, and they did it well. Nate told them they were very brave, and he wished to meet them in happier times. The other men were waiting on the road in their vehicles. Nate and Tim packed up and drove away. After about 30 minutes, they arrived at a closed convenience store in a small town. Tim got out and used the payphone to make a call. As they drove, They saw a big fireball and then a glow on the skyline in the northeast. They heard police sirens and watched the firefighters arrive, quickly putting on their gear. The men said a prayer, then drove back to the ranch near Dripping Springs. Later, Nate and Tim sat at Tim's house in Cedar Park, watching the morning news on Austin TV. The news showed live footage of a burning area. The reporter talked about an explosion and a house fire by Lake Travis near Spicewood. A fire investigator was interviewed, but he couldn't share much until the fire cooled and they could check for evidence. It seemed there had been an explosion, maybe from gas, which caused the fire. No news was shared about survivors, and this worried the brothers. They thought the girls and his son should have been mentioned in the news. Tim called the sheriff's office in Karen's hometown. They said they had no new information and thanked him for providing his phone numbers. He called the local police and got the same response. Tim wanted to call Jeannie. Nate wanted to call Linda, but the plan said not to make any calls that could be listened to, so they waited. Their anxious waiting ended just after 9:30. A detective with the Austin Police Department said the boys were at Brackenridge Medical Center in Austin and were physically fine but upset. They were with a social worker and child psychologist. The detective asked Tim to come to the hospital right away. Tim agreed but asked where their mother was. The detective said he had no information about anyone except Tim's sons. Nate drove very fast on US 183, even scaring the crazy drivers on that road. There were no accidents, but the big truck went around slower cars. They sped down the road, covering 20 miles in just 20 minutes. Nate dropped Tim at the emergency entrance and went to find parking. Tim hurried inside to the desk, identified himself, and a call was made. A plainclothes police officer came, introduced himself as Detective Cox, and told Tim to follow him. Nate showed up as they were leaving. Tim introduced Nate as his brother, and they quickly went to the children's floor. The detective knocked on the door of a room where his boys were being cared for. A woman with red hair and a suit opened the door and invited them in. Patrick and Mark were sitting with an older woman in scrubs, facing away from them. When Patrick heard the door open, he turned around, jumped up and yelled, "Daddy!" He rushed over, knocking his chair down. Mark looked confused at first, but then ran over with a big smile, shouting, "Daddy! Daddy! Daddy!" Tim hugged both his sons tightly, shedding tears of joy while they kissed his cheeks and held him over and over. Nate stayed back with the detective and the woman. Tim spun his boys around, showering them with kisses. The happy reunion lasted several minutes until little Mark grabbed Tim's face with both hands and said, "Daddy, bad men took us from Granny and Gramps. We drove a long way, and then they took us for Mommy." Patrick jumped in and said, "Daddy, they took us to a big room, and Mommy was crying. The bad men were hurting her, and she was crying. They said they would hurt us too, but Mommy begged them to leave us alone. They took us outside, but she told us she loved us and to be good while waiting for you." "I hate those mean men," Mark added, turning Tim's face back to him. "Mommy said she loved us to the moon, but she was crying. Daddy, you need to find those bad men and get our Mommy back." Tears filled the eyes of every adult in the room, but Tim fought to stay calm for his boys. "There are many people looking for Mommy right now. We need to get you home and wait for them. We can call Granny and Gramps and visit them once they find Mommy." Tim turned to the detective and asked, "Have you found her?" The detective shook his head and said, "I'll tell you what I know soon. Please focus on your sons right now." Tim asked, confused, "How did you find my sons but not my wife? They should have been together." The detective explained, "Your sons were with two young ladies. They were hiding in a ditch near the fire site on Lake Travis. I will share more details once we talk later." The detective added, "We will leave you here with your sons for now. There's a phone you can use to call their grandparents or anyone else. Is it okay if I talk to your brother while you're with your boys?" "Sure," Tim replied. "If you hear anything about Karen, please come tell me right away before you go. Who are the girls they were with?" The detective told him their names and asked if he recognized them. Tim said he knew both girls. They were students at the high school where he taught. One of them was in his second period physics class, and he knew they did dance and also ran track. As far as he knew, they had never babysat for his sons, so he wondered why they were with the boys in such a strange place instead of his wife. Cox promised again that he would share what he knew later. After spending more time holding and talking to his sons, Tim turned to the woman in scrubs. He asked if she could stay and read to the boys while he called their grandparents to let them know the boys were safe. She quickly agreed, and the boys reluctantly sat back down in their small chairs while she read to them. Tim first called his parents and asked them to tell Linda, Daniel, and Dora the good news. Then, he called Karen's parents to share that the boys were okay, but that their daughter was still missing. They wanted to come to the hospital, but he asked them to stay in case Karen tried to contact them. Next, Tim called Andy. He told Andy what he learned about his sons and wife, and asked him to pass the information to their housemates. "Andy, I know the girls my boys were with, but I have no idea why they were with them. I'm also worried they need a lawyer. They might have to explain a lot to the police, including how they took the boys and vanished just before an explosion." "Don't worry, they both have lawyers. Janice's dad is a friend. I offered my help when they went missing, and he called me as soon as they were found. We're meeting with the police this afternoon at 3:30 in my office. I'm also helping Sharon." Meanwhile, the little boys were exhausted and fell asleep on Tim's lap almost as soon as he sat down with them. The woman in scrubs quietly introduced herself as a doctor who helps children who have been through tough times. She said she had been assigned to look after his sons and offered to stay with them if he wanted to talk to the police officer now. Tim was directed to a conference room on the ground floor, where he found Detective Cox, his brother, and 2 Texas Rangers talking quietly. They stopped when he entered, and the detective asked him to sit at the table. Jim Boyd was one of the Rangers. He introduced the other man as his boss, Chief Ollie. The serious way Chief Ollie spoke matched the worried looks on the faces of the officers and Tim's brother. "Mr. Kelly, we have some bad news. We found a body on a boat across the lake from a house that exploded and burned last night. We believe it is your wife. We will need you to identify the body. Your brother saw a picture and thinks it is her. Can you take a look?" As soon as Tim walked into the room, he felt overwhelmed with emotions. He had been holding it all in since the attack at the ranch, through everything that happened at the lake, and finally seeing his sons. The picture of Karen broke his guard, and he cried deeply for several minutes. No one spoke or tried to comfort him, but they all felt his pain. When he managed to calm down, Tim dried his eyes, looked at the chief, and said, "That's Karen, my wife. I'm sorry for losing control like that. We had some fights these last few months. Many hurtful things were said and done. Now we won't have the chance to work it out. I loved her with all my heart from the moment I saw her, and now." Tears fell from Tim's eyes again, but he lowered his head and looked at the table, refusing to cry more over something he could not change. Boyd left the room, leaving Nate and Tim alone. Nate put his hand on Tim's arm. "I know those tears were real. Despite what happened these last few months, she was a wonderful woman, a great wife, and an amazing mother. We all mess up at times. Sadly, hers was a big mistake. Now you have 2 incredible kids to raise on your own. We don't know how things will work out with Jeannie, but Linda and I are here for you no matter what." "I know," Tim replied. "That helps. Those boys will need all the family they can get now. You're right. She was a great mother." Karen's parents arrived an hour later. The boys were still asleep, and he was relieved they were. When he told them that Karen's body had been found, they were heartbroken. Her mom needed calming pills from the doctor assigned to the boys while she settled down. Tim then drove to the morgue to identify the body, leaving Nate with Karen's parents. He knew what he would find, and it broke his heart again. He wished he could bring back the people who had hurt them so he could make them suffer longer before they died. He knew that Speth had begged to die before he was killed, but if he had the chance, he would keep him alive longer. The only hope he had for revenge was in what Boyd might find. When the video and recordings were looked at, he looked forward to the truth. The investigator from the Travis Sheriff's Department asked if he could have a moment of Tim's time, which he gave without complaint. The questions were simple and showed how little they knew. They didn't learn anything new from Tim. However, Tim learned something. The van with the severed fingers was found on a farm road near Pleasanton. Larry, Slaughter, and Benton were identified by their fingerprints, and they were working to identify the others. Tim returned to the hospital, signed forms, and agreed to let his son see a counselor for help dealing with their mom's trauma and loss. The boys were awake now and were talking and playing with their grandparents. Nate, the doctor, and the counselor were with the two boys. Tim sat with one boy on each knee and softly told them what happened. He explained that their mom was in heaven with God, Jesus, and the angels. She was happy and watching over them. She would always be there for them if they needed her. Mark cried quietly, his tears soaking Tim's shoulder. But Patrick got upset. It was those bad men, wasn't it, Daddy? They hurt Mommy. I yelled at them, but they didn't stop. I want to find those men and make them pay for hurting Mommy. Daddy wants the same. The police will catch those men and they will be punished. Tim told Patrick no. It was the two policemen who took us. They shot another policeman and brought us to the place where they hurt Mommy. I don't like policemen, Tim said as he hugged both boys tightly. Most policemen are good, but sometimes some are bad. Those two are bad. But Ranger Jim is good, right? Patrick nodded and started to cry again. I love Mommy. I want her with us, not in heaven. We need her. The next hour was very sad. Both boys cried, and so did their grandparents. The doctor and the counselor were crying too. Even Nate and Tim shed some tears while trying to comfort everyone. Eventually, the emotion made everyone tired. Tim took the boys home in Nate's pickup truck. Nate followed with their parents, who were too upset to drive. Once everyone was settled in, Nate hurried to Mr. Gaddis to pick up pizza and spaghetti. Grandma and Grandpa took the boys outside to play on their swing set. Tim called his parents and asked them to spread the word. They said Linda had already told them, and they were ready to come when Tim wanted. He asked them to wait until he called tomorrow. Then he tried to call Andy, but there was no answer. So he called his housemates. Jimmy told him Andy was meeting with two girls, their parents, and the investigator for their case. He also said that Jim Boyd had gotten a warrant to search a government office, and he was there now with another ranger he trusted. Jimmy asked Tim to stay at his house and promised to keep him updated. Tim thought for a moment, knowing the next call might be difficult, but he called anyway. Jeannie answered, "Hello?" Tim paused for a second. He spoke formally, saying, "Jeannie, this is Tim. I want to say I'm sorry that your husband has died." Jeannie took a moment and replied, "Thank you, Tim. I heard that Karen has also passed away. I'm really sorry about that. I know you and your sons are heartbroken. Is there anything I can do to help?" Tim heard her voice and wanted to rush to her. He longed for her kindness and support, but he couldn't do that right now. So he declined her offer and made sure to say he hoped to offer his condolences in person someday. She asked about the funeral plans. Tim said it was too soon to talk about that because they needed to perform an autopsy before they could release her body. He asked about Larry. Jeannie said his parents were planning a memorial in Chicago for family, but nothing was arranged in Texas because his body had not been found. They promised to keep each other updated and hung up. They didn't say anything that could raise suspicion if someone was listening in on their call, but it felt like an unsatisfying conversation. The smell of bacon frying and coffee brewing woke Nate and Karen's parents. The boys were playing in the living room. They weren't as sad, but they weren't their happy selves either. Breakfast of eggs, bacon, biscuits, milk, and coffee with friendly talk started the day well. After sending the boys outside to play, Grandma went back inside and asked Nate to find out if they had learned anything new. He nodded and picked up the phone. His first call was to the coroner, who said the body would likely be ready for release tomorrow. Next, he called the sheriff's department investigator, but there was no new information. The third call came from Jim Boyd, who asked when Tim and the other investigator could meet him. Tim said they could meet, but in a safe place. Boyd suggested the Horseman residence in an hour. Tim told his in-laws he needed to meet with the Texas Rangers about their daughter's death. Tim and Nate drove to Northwest Austin. They met around the Horseman's dining room table, with Boyd and Terry sitting across from Tim and Nate. Jimmy, Patty, and Andy sat at the ends of the big table and listened in. Boyd let Ranger Terry lead the questions, which are usual for police interviews. Tim answered clearly and confidently without needing help from the three lawyers present. This made Terry believe Tim didn't have anything to hide. Boyd asked a few questions of Nate, but he pretended not to know anything more than what Tim had shared. Ranger Terry left at 4:30, saying he had promised to attend his daughter's cheerleading tryouts at 6. After he left, Boyd checked the room for hidden microphones while the others talked and then joined them again. Boyd asked the lawyers if Nate is also their client. Nate took out 3 $20 bills and handed one to each lawyer. They all said Nate was fine. Tim and Nate said they would keep this conversation private. Boyd continued, based on information from Andy's clients. Ranger Terry and I executed a search warrant at a state office. What we found was very troubling, to say the least. I can't share details, but we made copies and gave the originals to a trusted friend at the FBI. We placed the copies in different spots because we weren't sure how the fibers will react when they check the evidence. We know that many important people could be in trouble, and they will do anything they can to keep this quiet. Some might make deals. Some could resign, and some may escape being punished, or they might go after everyone involved. Terry and I will be ready and alert at all times, and I suggest you do the same. Tim, no one knows what part you had in this, but your name is linked to it, so be careful. Now, can I have a few minutes alone with the brothers? I promise not to ask hard questions. The lawyers left the room and shut the door. Tim, did you ever watch the videos you got from Roger's house? Most, not all, Tim replied. Why? We need to watch them now if you still have them. This mess started before Karen and includes many more women. It reaches the highest parts of the state and even into federal levels. There are names everyone knows from sports, movies, and business. If any of them are in those videos, we need to find out, Boyd told him urgently. Can we trust all 3 lawyers, or do we need to go somewhere else? Tim assured him that they had already seen many of the videos and were completely trustworthy. The laughter faded when they entered the den with serious looks on their faces. Jimmy got the videos from his safe and they looked at the titles, trying to find hints about what was on them. 2 unlabeled tapes were wrapped together in plastic. They looked used, but Tim thought they were only partly watched or rewound. So they put one in, rewound it, and hit play. Both tapes were recorded in a long format, meaning they could run for over 400 minutes each. After watching for an hour, they knew that the videos showed encounters happening one after the other. To find out who was involved, they would need to watch them all. One thing was clear. The claims that rich and powerful people were deeply involved were true. Tim needed to get back to his family, and Boyd did too. They asked the people in the house to make 3 copies, keep the originals and 1 copy safe, and give one to Tim and one to Jim Boyd. They agreed and said that they would keep the copies locked up until they could be watched by everyone later. Before leaving, Sharon, Jana, and their parents agreed to keep the 3 of them updated. Can we borrow your office? 30 minutes later, they were on their way home, happy that the girls' meeting with the sheriff's investigators went well. The house was lively when Nate and Tim got there. The boys were busy having fun with his parents, his sister Jan and her husband Gary, and Nate's wife Linda. Karen's parents were making hamburgers with all the fixings while Grandpa Paul tended the grill and Granny Beth washed, sliced, and arranged everything on trays. Paul and Beth had already received condolences before Tim arrived. His family loved to hug, and there were plenty of tears during the hugs, especially from his mother. Linda gave him a big hug and whispered that she loved him and his boys and to take care of each other. After the meal and cleanup, everyone gathered in the living room to watch the boys play and talk. Their grandmothers gave them baths at 7:30, and their dad read them a story before bed. He didn't finish before they fell fast asleep. Tim returned to the grown-up talk and was about to sit down when the phone rang. He answered it in the kitchen and was surprised to hear, "Hey, Primo, it's good to hear your voice. It's been a while." Tim stepped back into the doorway and signaled for Nate to come over. "Good evening, Primo Martin. How are you?" Nate perked up when he heard the name. Tim held the phone so Nate could hear. "I'm doing okay," Martin replied. "Unlike a lot of your friends in an Imago house, Texas can be a dangerous place. For some people. For others, not so much," Tim said. "I'm very sorry about KJ. He lost a beautiful wife," Martin said sadly. "She was a lovely woman and a good mother to your sons. I know you and I had nothing to do with it, even though someone tried to make it look like we did. The caverns needed to be stopped, and from what I'm hearing, it seems like some drug deal went wrong. I never thought of you as part of it, though. I'm sure you were in Mexico at your house," Martin continued. "No, I was there, and our local contact was not involved either, but we are friends. You know I would never hurt your family," Tim said quickly. They both knew their words were careful, but that was how things needed to be said because Martin was about to make a proposal. I guess the person who cut up the bodies thought they could blame some Mexican gang and confuse the police. You think maybe they figured we couldn't be convicted because we were innocent with good alibis? There are some well-connected people who have a good idea of who is involved and who isn't, Martin explained. I heard the clues were mixed up. Some think it's one gang, others think it's another. It seems like the police are confused about the fingers, but they're not looking too hard because those guys were all wanted. The coroner says the fingers were cut off the dead bodies to prove they are dead. I don't know a lot about what happened by the lake, but it sounds like they're just trying to figure out who the remains belong to. You don't know, do you? No, I don't, Pedro. I can ask around if you want me to, Martin replied. I know you will. You will want to know who hurt your wife, kids, and those other young women. The news talks about small Mickey Mouse ears. Please, Cousin Martin, I really want to know. I might need help when I find out, Tim explained. Anything I can do for free, Martin said. Okay, let me know if you find out anything, Tim asked. Nate shook his head in surprise as they went back to the living room where everyone was silent. Their dad, John Michael, asked, What was that about? Who called you? A very surprising call from Cousin Martin, Tim replied. He offered his sympathy and asked if he could help in any way. I heard you call him Cousin Martin. Who is he? Karen's dad asked. He's not really my cousin, at least not in the usual way. In South Texas and northern Mexico, calling someone cousin means you treat them like family, whether they are or not. I met him when I was in college. He helped us with some issues back then. He offered to help again, and I asked him to tell me if he learned anything important. He is a powerful man in Mexico and has a lot of influence in Texas, so maybe he can help again, Tim explained. In the living room, Nate, Tim, and their dad were having coffee and speaking quietly while watching the news at a low volume when Tim suddenly sat up and turned the volume up a bit. The Attorney General was giving an update on the fire, which he had shared just before the 10 p.m. news. He praised a man named Og Spaeth, calling him brave and promising to find those responsible for his death. Tim looked at Nate in disbelief. So, this is how they are going to handle it. They have the tape. They know exactly what happened. That's it. I'm done with them. Time to take action, Tim said, and walked into the kitchen to call Jim Boyd. Good morning. I was expecting your call since last night, Jim said. Before you start, can you meet me for breakfast at that little place we both like? We need to talk. Tim agreed and got dressed. I'm meeting the ranger in charge of the investigation. I'll be back in an hour or I'll call you, he said. Tim took a longer route to make sure no one was following him. Jim was sitting in the last booth at the back with 2 cups of coffee. Tim started to speak, but Jim interrupted him. Just listen to me first, and then I'll listen to you. Tim nodded, and Jim continued. Many important people are in trouble, and they are sticking together. I'm not sure how much I can do. Do you have any ideas? I do, Tim replied. I was ready for this. Do you want to know, or would you rather stay out of it? In for a penny, in for a pound, my friend. What's your plan? Jim asked. Tim nodded and looked around to ensure no one could see him speaking before sharing his plan. I have a friend from college who is rising in television news. She is hardworking and passionate about protecting our freedoms. She won't back down from a tough story. I'm going to give her some important video and audio. This will help her build an audience, and then I'll give her more information. When will the Attorney General speak again? Jim asked. Not until Thursday morning at 11 unless we give him something earlier, Jim replied. Don't do that, Tim warned. That will work perfectly. She will be in Austin for the press conference, I promise. Will the other law enforcement officers be with him? Jim asked. Yes and no. I'm second in charge in case they need someone to blame, but I'm being told what I can and cannot do. I'm not important enough to be on stage with them. Well, good. That means you have about 75 hours to find a safe place, Tim said. The Attorney General took the microphone and began his speech. He was surrounded by important figures like the DPS chief and some strong lawmakers. He praised the OC police chief again and offered to answer questions from his favorite reporters. At first, the soft questions came from his supporters, and he answered smoothly. But then Carolyn fired a series of tough questions, which made the Attorney General even more nervous. He tried to brush off her questions as wrong and unfair, but other reporters clearly knew about the situation too, and he was not given any easy time. By the time his PR person pulled him off the stage because he had other appointments, the situation had gotten messy. As he left the stage, the lieutenant governor pulled him aside and told him to follow him for a meeting. Unfortunately for him, when he reached his office, his wife was on the phone yelling about a video she had received. She was so angry that he could barely understand her, but he did catch her final words. "How could you? You have daughters." He hung up, looked around at the group of men and said, ignoring his female secretary, "We're in big trouble because of that call." Now, their meeting shifted focus from how to discredit the reporter and find out where she got her information to how to save their jobs, their power, or their homes. That very day, edited videos showing the faces of older men but not the girls began airing on the Houston station where Carolyn worked. Some familiar faces included Aggie Spaeth from AG West, Lieutenant Governor Daniels, and various leaders in the legislature. A few days later, business tycoons had their turn in the spotlight, along with a senator and 3 members of Congress. At this time, news about the scandals in Texas was all over the country. Feminists and religious leaders called for accountability. Some religious leaders stepped back from the call for punishment when videos of their actions were made public. One feminist leader even left the country right before her own video came out. Many moving trucks were seen in the wealthy areas of West Austin. In the following days and weeks, divorce lawyers were very busy. The governor kept a low profile, saying he would let the system deal with everything and would step in if necessary. By the end of the second week, he was feeling a bit calmer. His heart was back to normal, and he found himself sitting at the dining table with his wife, who looked quite upset. The governor's video never aired. However, 2 days later, it was reported that he resigned to go back to his law practice. One of his last actions as governor was to appoint Jim Boyd as the new director of the Department of Public Safety, after the last director sadly died by suicide. Soon after her video was shown, Karen was laid to rest in her hometown next to her beloved grandmother. Tim gave a touching speech at her funeral. He talked about her being a teacher, a wife, and a mother who made a great sacrifice to protect her children. He knew most of the guests, and they were aware of how she had died. He chose not to mention those events, instead focusing on her many good qualities. As Tim was finishing his speech and about to sit down, he paused. He thought about what to say next and looked out at the audience. "Before I finish, I want to share a story. Take from it what you will. I'll call this story Too Magnificent." There was a rancher in South Texas who cared deeply for the animals on his land. He made sure the wildlife had enough food even during the hot, dry summer, feeding grain to the quail and protein to the deer year-round. Because he provided for them, the animals thrived. Within 5 years, he had the healthiest deer herd in the area. One young buck stood out to him. He watched as the buck grew, and when it reached the age of 5 years, it had impressive antlers with 14 points and a span of over 36 inches. This buck ruled over the herd, mating with does and passing on its strong genes. At age 5, the rancher counted 16 points and believed it would break records for typical bucks with 8 points on each side. News spread about this remarkable buck. Rich hunters approached the rancher, eager to pay a lot of money to hunt the trophy. The rancher refused, knowing the young buck would breed for years before slowing down. The wealthy hunters kept trying, but he stood firm, which made them angry as they weren't used to being turned down. There were other threats, like road hunters who wandered near his ranch. The buck was wise and learned to avoid the road after seeing other young bucks get killed. The number of road hunters dropped after they were shot at one night. They complained to the police, but the police questioned why they were there at that hour. Eventually, the rich and powerful man grew tired of the rancher's refusal. He hired criminals to break the fence and kill the trophy buck. While the rancher was away with his wife, the majestic head was cut off and the trophy was taken. Yet the rancher continued to search for the criminals and got them to reveal who had paid them to do this. The rich man was arrested, and the buck's head was returned to the rancher, who cried over the future the animal would have had and the fawns it would never bring into the world. The rich man's lawyers got all the charges dropped, and he went back to his old habits. In the end, however, karma caught up to him. He was killed by a stray bullet in a hunting accident not far from the ranch where he had taken the buck. Many lessons can be drawn from this story, and I hope you think about them. But one point I want to leave you with is that it is possible to be too wonderful in a world where rich trophy hunters have so much power. We should be more like the rancher. We must stay aware and not bow down to those who are wealthy and powerful, many of whom got their wealth through questionable actions. Those who do wrong should not be admired. Their greed must be challenged. There are good rich people who use their wealth to help others, not harm them. When the wealthy seek even more wealth at the expense of good people, and when they purchase political favors, that is not democracy. It is plutocracy. We need to resist and fight against them and their betrayal of our democratic values. They buy political positions and then make laws that serve only themselves, harming us in the process. We must not allow these unethical people to control our state and country by purchasing our votes or the votes of those who represent us. My wife's wish was for us, the people, to take back control of our government. We should never choose leaders who rule with strictness until they are exposed for their wrongdoings. Keep this in mind when you vote in the upcoming special elections to fill the spots of the bad men who had to leave when they were revealed. Think about it again in the fall elections, when we can change the path of our state and country. Karen will be sadly missed by her family and friends, but whether her brave death mattered will depend on the choices we make together. God bless Karen. God bless and guide us. Thank you for being here. A heavy silence fell as Tim sat down. Jeannie looked out the window of her dad's SUV, watching the trees race by as they drove east to I-35 and then north to San Antonio. She seemed calm, but her face was serious, her body still, and her eyes focused. "A penny for your thoughts," her dad suggested. "I bet they are the same as yours, Dad. Worry for Tim's boys and wife, worry for Tim and the ones going with him, anger at those who caused this." "Sound about right?" she said without turning her head. "Pretty much. Add a lot of prayer and we're close. You know he has to do this right, honey?" "I know, Dad." After hearing the confessions and then watching a ranger and deputy take his children and Karen, he knows he can't trust anyone else. "I understand that, but it doesn't make it easier, does it?" It was quiet again as the lights of San Antonio got brighter and the ranch faded away. Jenny leaned her seat back, put her bare feet on the dashboard, and thought about the awful memory. In that moment, she remembered how she had hurt her husband. In the heat of the fight, the shotgun had seemed so easy to set aside, but now those memories crawled back. How could she have so easily taken the life of someone she had loved and promised to be with forever? At that moment, it felt like the only choice. It was kill or be killed. Yet now other thoughts nagged at her mind. "You really didn't have a choice, baby. He came after you wanting to take you away. He let men use you for money and ruined your life. Yes, he was your husband, but he gave that up when he cheated on you and hurt you for not believing his lies. If you hadn't pulled the trigger, he would have killed him, maybe even me, and taken you too. Don't let doubts creep in. You had no choice." She understood that. Hearing her dad say it out loud helped a little. She returned her thoughts to Tim and his urgent mission. The possibilities scared her. She forced herself to think about them. He could be successful, rescue his wife and kids and bring them to safety. If that happened, would he go back to Karen? That thought hurt her heart because she knew she cared for him. He might save his family but get caught by people in power who wouldn't want the truth to come out. He could find his family dead, kill everyone responsible, and spend his life in prison. His claims could be tossed aside by the corrupt leaders who have power. He could die trying. The only good ending she could imagine was that he safely brings his family home, leaves Karen, marries her, and they live happily ever after. That made her smile, but just for a moment. The chances seemed slim. Once they got home, Joe parked in the garage and shut the doors, stepping out of the car with his gun in hand, making her follow him. Amelia and Kathy were waiting just inside. They hugged and exchanged warm words. Joe turned to his younger daughter, holding her arms gently but firmly, and asked, "Did you see the checkpoints as we got near the neighborhood? Jeannie, did you see the quick flash from the trees as we drove towards the house?" She looked confused and shook her head. "Those are my people. But what if they weren't? I don't like that we are in this situation. You have to stay alert." Your life and our lives may depend on it. We don't know who they are or what they know, but they know you were Larry's wife, and they put a bounty on you. What happened in South Texas doesn't change that. You are still in great danger, and because of that, so are your sister, mother, father, and anyone with you. The threat didn't go away just because some are gone. If anything, the price on your head has gone up, and mine too. Your mom and sister could be in danger. We are just good targets and nothing more. But we must think that the people in power still want you for the same reasons. I hate to say this when you're feeling low, but you can't afford to stumble through these times in a fog of regret and fear. We need Jeannie from the ranch, not our little princess. Jeannie hugged her dad tightly and cried. Her mom and sister joined in and held her close as her dad stroked her hair and told her to let it all out because she would need to be strong today, tonight, and for the days ahead. She didn't realize she had this many tears inside her, but after a few minutes of crying, she felt a strange sense of calm and resolution start to settle in her. Her mom and Kathy had stopped crying and were just holding her. Finally, she let go of her dad, straightened up, and said, "Thank you, my dear family. I really needed that. I guess I had to let that out to face the awful past month and the uncertain present and future. Mom, Kathy, let's sit around the kitchen table and talk about what's going on." The update lasted over an hour because Jeannie and Joe were very open and honest about what happened. Kathy gasped a few times and put her hand over her chest. Her mother shook her head and closed her eyes, unable to handle the terrible things they talked about. Hearing Joe's stories about Vietnam before knowing him was one thing, but now having her own daughter part of such dangerous situations felt different. At times, they all had tears in their eyes, but they knew they had to face these hard truths. They wanted to talk as much about it as they could. Joe showed Jeannie where he had hidden different guns around the house. He suggested she keep a handgun in her purse for safety. He gave similar small guns to his wife and older daughter and made sure they all had a plan in case something happened. Joe reminded his girls to always think about being safe. 6 weeks ago, Jeannie said, I was married to Larry and didn't see any of this happening around me. I must have been blind to the truth. I was foolish for not leaving when he first hurt me, which was only 6 months after we got married. Looking back, I wanted him to be someone he wasn't. I ignored the bad parts and focused on the good, holding on to him like a fool. It's no wonder he didn't respect me. Sweetheart, I think part of your troubles came from your dad and me. You were always happy and popular in school. We didn't prepare you for the tough times or for men like Larry. It was a hard lesson, but you've learned it, and you can only move forward. Am I making the same mistake with Tim? He seems perfect to me. Am I imagining good things about him like I did with Larry? I hope not, because I've never felt so much for anyone before, but I need to hear what others think. Kathy shook her head. Alan says he's a good guy, and I feel like he really cares about you. Amelia put her hand on her daughter's arm and said, I don't know Tim very well, but there are things about him I never saw in Larry. We thought Larry would become a good husband and eventually a good father, but he didn't change. He just tried to control you instead of building a real relationship in your marriage. We were worried about all of you. I don't see any of those issues with Tim, but Joe knows him better. Joe, don't compare your ex-husband to Tim, Jeannie. They are very different. As your mother said, Larry was a fake. He seemed like a good man, but he had no real values or courage. Tim has all those qualities, maybe even too much. When I see you two together, it's clear there is a strong connection. Really, it seems like a lightning bolt between you. He paused to smile at his daughter, who blushed at the thought of that connection. But go slow. He chuckled. Or as slowly as you can. When you two are together, it's like a whirlwind sweeping everyone up. I should have kept you apart, but it's hard to ignore how you feel together. Well, that's all in the past. Now we need to hope that Tim and his team are safe and can move forward. I honestly can't tell what will happen next, especially for Tim, who is in a situation he didn't create. I know you love each other, but love alone might not be enough. With that, I see we are talking about things we cannot control. How do you feel about going to the chapel to pray for strength and for good to win over evil tonight? Father Jose saw them in the chapel and noticed how they seemed. He went into the confessional, turned the light on, and waited. Amelia went in first, then Kathy. Confessions were usually normal for a priest in San Antonio, but what he heard from Joe and even sweet Jeannie, whom he had watched grow up, was more serious than anything he had faced before. There was no simple penance he could give them, so he told them to pray. He prayed and prayed for them. He wished he could have told them never to repeat such actions, but if they hadn't acted, good people would be in danger, and Jeannie might be trapped. He knew firsthand what happens when evil men win over good ones. Despite what the church says today, he couldn't blame good people for fighting against darkness. Years ago, Amelia had convinced Joe to build a covered chapel and dining area by his barbecue pit. Crosses and statues of Mary decorated the chapel. As night approached, Joe asked if they would like him to grill steaks and vegetables for dinner in the chapel. They thought that was a wonderful idea, made even better when he brought out a boombox and played cheerful gospel music on the cassette player. They kept talking pleasantly, trying to help Jeannie forget about the rescue mission. It worked somewhat, but you could see the worry on her and her father's faces. Jeannie ate very little, just picking at her food while joining in the conversation. After dinner, Kathy cleaned up the plates and plastic forks, while Joe took care of the grill. Amelia opened a storage door that also served as a small altar. She brought out some kneeling pads and placed them on the altar. Then she took a special box from the cabinet, turned to her daughters, and handed each of them a rosary. She suggested it might be a good time to say some prayers. Jeannie didn't reply right away. Instead, she took the beads, set a pad on the altar, looked up at the statue of Mary, and knelt down to pray. The others quickly joined her while soft music played in the background. They prayed together, saying the rosary and then saying Hail Mary 3 times. Jeannie stayed quiet, praying silently for the people being rescued and the rescuers. Amelia soon asked her to come and sit with them at the table to hold hands and keep praying. They stayed in the small chapel until the phone rang on the back porch. Around 3 a.m., Joe rushed outside to answer it, and the others gathered behind him. "No problem, Ranger. I couldn't sleep tonight either," he said. He listened for several minutes and then let out a dry laugh. "Thanks for the update, Jim, even if you are pretty drunk. I would have liked to be out there fishing all night, but I had to take care of business. Glad you had a good night." Joe continued, "You caught some nice fish and no one fell overboard?" After a short pause, he added, "Now you all need to put away the beer and get some rest. You never know what tomorrow will bring." Joe turned with a big smile and announced, "If I understand correctly, they rescued the kids. They're safe, and no one on the team was hurt." Jeannie felt relief wash over her, and Kathy hugged her tightly. Joe continued, "Jim was slurring his words. He said everyone was drunk and suggested I stay up to watch the early news like they were planning to do because they heard something big was going to happen on Lake Travis. He thought the talk was just a cover in case someone was listening. But I think we should make some coffee and watch the morning shows that start at 4:30. The coffee smelled amazing and tasted good, but nothing exciting happened in the first news segment. Then, just after the 5 o'clock news started, there was a breaking news update. The news anchor described a terrible explosion and fire at a home on Lake Travis. He said the house was destroyed and the flames were still burning. They suspected a gas leak caused by a buildup in the basement before it ignited. The news didn't mention if there were survivors, so they waited for more information. At 8:30, Jeannie received a phone call from the Department of Public Safety. After apologizing for the early call and for the bad news, the official told her they had identified her husband's death through a severed finger. When she asked how they knew he was dead and not just hurt, he explained that forensics showed he had already died when the finger was found. He said no other remains had been discovered, but they were searching where the finger was located near Pleasanton. Jeannie knew the actual remains were far away, buried under sand, and they might never be found. This thought made her heart feel heavy with sadness. After getting another cup of coffee, she gathered her strength and called her husband's parents in Chicago. They were heartbroken over their son's death, and his mother clearly blamed Jeannie for leaving him. Jeannie took a deep breath, said she was sorry, and brought up some good memories they had shared, including last Christmas. When the talk turned to planning a memorial service for when the body was recovered, the conversation became awkward. His mother started to cry again. She wished them well and said they'd talk again when there was more news before hanging up. Jeannie thought they blamed her for leaving him. If they only knew the truth, she thought sadly. And then she started crying again. Some tears were for her husband, but even more were for the guilt she felt, believing she had caused his death and the pain his parents were feeling. Exhausted, Jeannie fell asleep on the couch. Her mom covered her up, and then she and Kathy went upstairs to nap. Joe went to his dealership to check on things, but he came back a couple of hours later to join the sleepers. Around 12:30, the phone rang. Amelia answered it, and then went to wake Kathy, giving her the phone. Kathy talked for about 10 minutes before heading to the living room to wake Jeannie. "Jeannie, Alan called," she said. "Tim's boys were found in the brush near the fire site. They were with 2 high school students, and they are all safe. Tim is going to the morgue to identify his wife's remains. She was found on a boat across the lake from the fire. She had been killed." Jeannie cried tears of joy for Tim and his sons, but also tears of sadness for Karen. Whatever happened, she didn't deserve to die like that. A few hours later, Tim called, using a formal tone. He expressed his sadness about Larry's death and offered his condolences. Jeannie responded formally, sharing her sorrow for the loss he and his sons were feeling. She also offered her help. He thanked her but said no, and then offered to help her. She politely said no back. She knew they couldn't be together like this, but she needed Tim more than she had ever needed anyone. That made her cry. The Hildebrand family had a very late lunch or early dinner together, just some chicken noodle soup and crackers. After watching the evening news, which didn't add much to what they already knew, they went to bed. Amelia woke her daughters at 7 and told them to come eat breakfast tacos before they got cold. Joe had eaten earlier and left for the car dealership. Before he left, he said there was no new news about the house fire that morning. The 3 women ate breakfast together while drinking coffee and having a nice chat. They talked about anything but the hard times they had been through. At 10:30, they decided to get groceries and maybe stop by North Star Mall for some shopping. They talked it over and decided to dress up a little, thinking it might put them in a better mood. So they all wore sundresses and comfy heels. Amelia called the dealership and left a message for Joe, telling him where they were going. Just as Mom and Sister were about to go out the door, Jeannie remembered something Dad had warned them about. "Mom, Kathy, did you bring your guns? I'm going back to get mine. Do you need yours too?" She did. Even though they had gone to the gun range with Joe a lot, carrying guns wasn't something they did every day. First, they went to North Star Mall because they needed to buy food that needed to be kept cold, and they enjoyed shopping for clothes more than groceries. They left with a bag from Foley's and another from Frost Brothers. They stopped for a bite at the food court and picked up another bag each from their next stop, feeling happy as they carried their bags. They left the mall and walked toward Amelia's car, which was parked near a big new sculpture of Justin's boots in the north parking lot. For some reason, Jeannie started watching a white van that was moving slowly, staying close to them about 3 rows over. She kept watching it and then called out to her mom and sister, pretending she needed to stop to fix her bags. They laughed at her until they saw her worried face. Jeannie turned her back to the van and told them to look behind her but not to stare. "Pretend you're looking at me and look over my shoulder. Can you see the white van? It has been moving slowly toward us by the car. I don't know if we're in danger, but to be safe, let's go back inside the mall and call Dad. If they turn around or back up when we start going back, drop your bags and run." She laughed loudly, pointed toward the mall, and started walking that way with her mom and sister right behind her. As soon as they turned around, the van backed up, turned around, and sped up toward them. They dropped their bags and started to run, but it was clear they were too far away to outrun the van. Jeannie led them behind a big pickup truck and pulled out her gun from her purse. Mom and Kathy followed her lead. They crouched behind the truck with Kathy looking over the hood at the van. It stopped, and 3 men jumped out and rushed toward them, dodging between cars. They were holding something in their hands. Jeannie took charge. "Mom, go to the front. You take the one on the right. Kathy, you can see over the hood. Take the one in the middle. I'll go behind the truck and take the one on the left. Wait until they come out around the trucks to shoot." The men only seemed focused on getting to them. The first man came out, and Amelia fired. A moment later, Kathy fired too. The man on the left stopped and shot at the truck, breaking glass but not hitting anyone. Jeannie shot him in the chest, and when he didn't go down, she shot him again. The van had turned down the road toward the mall when it saw the women shooting at them and sped up. Jeannie moved to the back corner of the truck to get a shot at the driver. Amelia and Kathy got ready to shoot at the van. Jeannie noticed the man her mom shot was trying to grab his gun on the ground. She shot at him, hitting him in the shoulder, and yelled that if he moved again, she would shoot him. A rifle appeared from the passenger window of the van, and the man leaned out to aim. "Shoot the driver!" Jeannie yelled, and she shot twice at the man with the rifle. She heard 4 more shots, and the van swerved, hitting the corner of a parked Lincoln car. It was silent for a moment, and then a man jumped out of the sliding door with a machine gun and shot at their truck. When he stopped shooting and started running, Jeannie steadied herself and fired, hitting him in the back. He fell to the ground, screaming in pain. Mall security and a police car arrived quickly, within a minute. The women stayed crouched behind the truck, unsure if there were more gunmen or if the ones they shot were pretending. The police yelled for everyone to come out with their hands in the air, but Amelia shouted back, "We're not coming out until you check the van and the men who are hurt by us. They shot at us and tried to take us. We don't know if it's safe yet." 2 more police cars pulled up around the crime scene. Nobody forced the people to come out, but a sergeant with a loudspeaker warned them to put down their guns. Only then would the officers check the van and help those lying on the ground. They placed their guns on the pavement and raised their hands but stayed behind the truck. 2 officers moved in quickly to look at the van. One officer checked the man lying in the street who was groaning in pain, while 2 other officers checked the men closest to the women. Then they focused on Jeannie, Kathy, and Amelia, telling them to come out from behind the truck. They did, with their hands up. The women were held at the police station for more than 3 hours, while the police sorted through the many details coming in from both other law enforcement and the survivors. Joe and his lawyer arrived within 15 minutes after being called. But the police didn't ask the women many questions in the first 2 hours. Everything changed when the police discovered that the men were part of a local gang. They read the gang members a list of crimes they had committed that day, including attempted kidnapping and other serious charges. When offered the chance to talk to the district attorney about lowering their charges, the gang leader, Darius, admitted they were contacted by a man who promised them $20,000 each for Amelia, Kathy, and Jeannie. He didn't know that man's name, but they had a phone number to call once they had the women. That's when the FBI got involved. The FBI received information from local law enforcement about possibly related events. They first asked Jeannie about an attempted break-in at her home, about the abuse claims she made against her husband, Larry, and about his recent death. She stuck to her story. Her family supported her, and after Joe warned that he might pull Jeannie out of the investigation, the FBI found it better to catch the person who hired the gang. The San Antonio police and the FBI came up with a plan. They had Darius call the number and say they had captured all 3 women. They were told to take the women to a warehouse on the southwest side near Kelly Air Force Base. This was in case a demand for ransom came later. 2 agents went back to Joe's business with him to set up a recorder for any incoming calls. Everyone, including Jeannie and her family, thought the attempted kidnapping was not about ransom. They believed it was linked to the earlier threats from her husband regarding a bounty for her. But they decided it was still worth trying. Joe and the agents stopped briefly in the dealership's waiting room for coffee and some sweetbread from a local bakery before entering his office to set up the recorder. They were enjoying their coffee and bread when the receptionist connected a call to Joe. "Joe Hildebrand, how can I help you?" A muffled voice replied, "We have your women, Joe Hildebrand. We plan to fly them to another country and sell them to the highest bidder. Your wife is older, but she will still bring a good price. As for your daughters, there's no telling how much we could get for them." "What do you mean you have them?" Joe replied. "I talked to them a few hours ago. They were shopping at the mall. You must be lying." "If you don't want to hear from them anymore, agree to our demands," the voice continued. "What demands?" "We want $100,000 for each woman when you deliver the money. You also tell us where Tim Kelly is. We have men all over the state. Once we verify Tim's location, we'll let you and the women go. But if you tell the cops, we'll kill you and sell the women." "Okay, I understand, but I need proof that you have my family. Let me talk to one of them. They're tied up in another room. I'll show them to you when you arrive in an hour. If you're not here, say goodbye to them." "Do you think I have $300,000 just lying around?" "I need a couple of hours to get the money," Joe replied. "You have 1 hour to collect the money. I'll call back then. If not, bye-bye, babies." The agents contacted the phone company and quickly updated their superiors. The police had already secured another service van from the same company that owned the first stolen van, and the SWAT team was ready to go. The plan was for them to drive to the warehouse, wait for the doors to open, and then drive inside. An armored truck would be close by and ready to respond if needed. But there was one big problem. The ransom call came from the office of a state senator. Joe stayed in his office with the two agents. The SWAT team headed toward the warehouse at the 40-minute mark, planning to enter only after the second ransom call. Another team was sent to the senator's office, ready to see if the call came from there, too. It did, exactly 60 minutes later. The SWAT team was inside the senator's office within 2 minutes of receiving the call and arrested 5 more gang members without firing a shot. The senator and 3 other men were present in his office when the police burst in, ready with their guns. The senator was still on the phone with Joe, trying to arrange the money drop when his world changed completely. Joe and Jim Boyd decided not to tell him about the kidnapping. They knew he would take it personally and might get involved. Tim learned about the attempt through TV and newspapers later, but only after everything was resolved and under control. So they were able to convince him that it was all over. He let it be known that he was not happy about not being told, but he accepted what had happened. In the days that followed, the Hildebrand family watched the government make a mess of things on TV. Wealthy businessmen, preachers, and even some women were making headlines as news stories came out one after another. They all knew where the stories were coming from, but didn't call anyone to celebrate. It wasn't the right time to step into the open. They did go to Karen's funeral, which had been delayed due to the investigation and autopsy. The service took place in her hometown, and they sat at the back with Jim Boyd and his wife. There were also her housemates, Alan, Chet, Jennifer, Randy Jackson, and many friends and co-workers of Karen and Tim. Tim's speech about Karen made everyone cry. They gathered outside before the graveside service. Alan brought them together quietly, talked about Karen's mistakes and her early death, and asked everyone to join him in a silent prayer for her. Jeannie prayed hard for her and promised to take care of Karen's kids if she could. After the short service at the gravesite, the Reverend invited everyone to the American Legion Hall to remember Karen and her work with children. The room was filled with photos and memories from her life, and at the center of a table was a big framed photo of her with her sons and husband. They were all smiling in that picture, which made the loss feel even sadder. Karen's little boys stood quietly in line with their grandparents and dad. They stayed strong until Laura and Will hugged them. They completely lost it when Patty and Jeannie knelt down and opened their arms. The boys jumped into their arms, hugging tightly and crying hard on their shoulders. This stopped the line, and Tim suggested loudly that the Reverend say a prayer and that everyone get some food. He wanted to see everyone before they left. He turned away for a moment to cry quietly, then wiped his eyes with his coat sleeve. When he turned back, he saw Patty and Jeannie holding the boys close as they talked to their grandparents. Chet put an arm around Tim's shoulders, and Will hugged him tightly from the other side. "Damn it all, Tim," Will said, his voice thick with emotion. "I wish all those responsible would suffer." Jim Boyd added quietly, "I feel like their sorry looks should burn in their cries. I swear to you, I will make them pay for what they did." Tim hugged Chet, and then they all stepped back, feeling a bit awkward. Everyone's focus was on Patty with Mark and Jeannie with Patrick as they picked food for their plates. Tim knew he needed to explain things to Karen's parents, but he wasn't worried since it was all innocent. He didn't want them to think poorly of Jeannie and Patty, so he planned to clear things up later. Tim sat down with his sons to eat, but the emotions of the day made him lose his appetite. Karen's parents and other family members were being looked after by Chet, Alan, and the Hildebrand family. Tim's parents, Linda and Nate, and Jan and Gary also tried to help keep them busy, hoping to give their minds a break from the sadness. It seemed to help, as Karen's parents smiled a few times during the meal, even if they didn't eat much. While he was away, the school board offered Tim the job of head football coach and director of athletics. They gave him a month to think about it and decide. Part of him just wanted to move on, but in the end, he took the job, sold their house, and bought a new one closer to the high school. He knew he couldn't escape Karen's memory anyway. The last poker player left, John Allen, had moved away after being divorced by a wife who was angry with him. Selling the house would take time, but he couldn't stay there, surrounded by memories. So Tim rented a nice older house with a big yard. The place was furnished because the older couple who lived there had moved in with their daughter because of their health. Tim changed the mattresses but kept the rest of the furniture. At first it made the boys sad not to be home, but they soon took to the new adventure. Even though both Tim and Jeannie went back to work in late April, they agreed to keep their relationship friendly out of respect for Karen. Jeannie felt for Tim and his boys, but they needed time to grieve. She too needed time and help to deal with the trauma from the earlier events. Knowing she would never live in their house again, she put it on the market and moved into an apartment. When school ended in mid-May, Tim took the boys to visit their grandparents for a week and then to his parents for another week. He felt uneasy about discussing what happened to Karen, but it wasn't needed. She had already told them everything in a way that was true, even if not too detailed. Tim told everyone that the boys had gotten to know Patty and Jeannie while staying with their housemates right before something bad happened to him. They learned this because the boys had shared it with them. Gramps finally interrupted and said, "Tim, you were a wonderful husband to our daughter. You are a great father to our grandkids, and you're a good son-in-law. We know you need to move forward. All we ask is that you help the boys remember their mom and let us see our grandchildren." He smiled and asked, "Kids can never have too many grandparents, can they?" Tim agreed. He promised he would always honor Karen and make sure her boys felt loved. After school ended and Jeannie returned to San Antonio, Tim started calling her almost every few days. Their conversations were friendly, not romantic. They were both hurt and scared to get closer. Larry's parents planned a service for him in Chicago over Memorial Day weekend, but Jeannie and her family were not invited. They remembered Larry in their own way, focusing on the happy times they shared. Jeannie said sorry again and prayed for Larry's soul. It was a tough night. On Tuesday, she went back to her counselor to talk about how confusing it was to love someone who had hurt her and to learn how to protect herself. On the second Wednesday in June, Tim called and asked Jeannie if she wanted to go on a trip to the coast with him for a week. She happily said yes and asked when they could leave. They both celebrated before Tim asked if she would come to the ranch the next day to meet his family and new friends for a couple of days before heading to Port Aransas. She arrived just in time for lunch with Tim's family on Thursday. They spent the afternoon together, exploring his hometown and meeting more of his friends and family. On Friday, Jeannie spent the morning with Tim and the boys, seeing more sights. They enjoyed a tasty lunch with the family and went swimming at the city pool that afternoon. Even though her swimsuit was modest, Jeannie caught the attention of some moms watching their kids swim just like Tim did. The four adults played games with the kids and put them to bed at 8. It was a relaxed but happy evening. On Saturday, they visited a museum that showcased local pioneer families, including Tim's family history. Saturday night, she enjoyed a quiet dinner with Lois, their partners, and some others in the barn at the ranch. It was a potluck dinner, and each woman loved to serve Jeannie a bit of her dish, insisting she had to try them with a friendly reminder that her portion was too small. Theodora kindly stepped in to help Jeannie when she realized she had eaten too much and drank a lot of iced tea to cool the burning in her throat. She felt uncomfortable from the meal and worried about her stomach later. No drinks were served because it was not a party, but a time for everyone to come together and be thankful that they were safe and together. Sheriff Miguel stood up, raised his glass, and thanked everyone for their support and for being together that night. Then it was Tim's turn, and he expressed his gratitude and love for everyone before he became too emotional and sat down. After a moment of silence, Jeannie spoke up. She thanked everyone for welcoming her into their group and joked about how grateful she was for the fun dances they taught her. She thanked the women for the tasty dishes and brought back the lively atmosphere. They returned to Tim's parents' house after midnight. He gently kissed her on the lips and they went to their own rooms. It felt like sparks had flown between them, rekindling their feelings. The next morning, Nate and Linda joined them for breakfast, and together they rode out to the ranch while the grandparents watched the boys. There was a bit of worry about what had happened on their last visit, but they couldn't see any signs of it. Nate didn't take them to the mass graves, but he told Tim that if he had done so, no one would have noticed. They stopped by the ranch house after checking on the cattle and horses. There were no signs of trouble there either. Linda brought sandwiches, chips, and drinks, and they spent several hours just enjoying each other's company. As time passed, laughter returned as Nate shared stories about his funny and scary memories. Jeannie caught the spirit and playfully pointed at their bed and teased Tim, making him smile. When they crossed the channel on the ferry, they saw dolphins playing, which made the boys jump up and down with joy. As they approached the landing, they hopped back in the truck, excitedly talking about the dolphins, eagles, and swimming in the ocean, while keeping an eye out for jellyfish and sharks. Their rental house was one of 3 in a small area on the dunes, just steps from the beach. A small sandy road led to 3 houses built on tall wooden posts. These houses were higher than the tall telephone poles. All 3 houses stood above the sand dunes, with a shared parking space in the middle, where each house had its own parking spot. Tim had rented the smaller 2-bedroom house in front. The 2 larger houses were empty until Wednesday morning when Jeannie, Tim's parents, and their siblings were coming to stay for the week. The bigger bedroom had a king bed and its own bathroom. The smaller bedroom had a queen bed and another bathroom nearby. Tim and the boys would stay in the larger bedroom, while Jeannie and the younger boy would be in the smaller one. They made sure to cover the boys with suntan lotion, put on their beach hats, and set up a sunshade to keep their food, drinks, toys, and chairs safe from the sun. They then headed to the beach, where they played in the waves and looked for shells in the sand. They almost forgot about the sun protection. Luckily, Jeannie remembered and insisted they put on more suntan lotion and wear their hats again before they started building sandcastles. Tim was great at making moats and walls, but he struggled with the fine details of building castles. Jeannie, however, was very good at shaping the sand. So Dad helped by carrying buckets of sand and water for the builders. They enjoyed burgers and shakes from a nearby stand. They sat on the deck, watching ships, planes, and the stars come out as the moon rose from the water. Mark fell asleep in Jeannie's lap, and Patrick dozed off on Dad's lap. When it was bedtime, Mark wouldn't let go of Jeannie. "I want to sleep with Mommy," he said, still sleepy. Tim shook his head but smiled. Jeannie smiled too, but there were tears in her eyes. The lines between them were getting blurred. On Tuesday, they tried surf fishing, where Dad helped to get the lines ready, and Jeannie helped the boys hold the fishing rods. Fishing turned out to be more trouble than fun, so they went to a dock and fished there. It didn't matter what fish they caught. It was still a big adventure filled with laughter, even if they didn't catch anything. They stopped at a seafood market and bought fish and shrimp to cook for dinner, along with hot dogs for lunch and a half-gallon of frozen custard for dessert. Their naps were a bit longer than usual, giving Jeannie and Tim time to talk more. Though she wore a simple one-piece swimsuit, it didn't hide her good looks very well. Tim couldn't help but notice how nice she looked that afternoon. She took every chance to pose, which only made Tim admire her more. They played in the waves and walked down the beach looking for shells and sand. The boys asked why some men were whistling and shouting when they passed a group of college guys. Dad explained they were just having fun. A little behind, he let out a loud whistle and shouted, "Yeah, baby," just like the boys. Jeannie smirked while Patrick and Mark looked confused. Tim pointed out a nearly perfect sand dollar he found, and the boys rushed over to add it to their bucket. He winked at Jeannie. She winked back, playfully swaying her hips as she walked back. The boys held Jeannie's hands, and Tim carried their bucket filled with treasures, some driftwood, and their ever-present beach bag. 2 older couples near the water stopped them, and one woman said, "We saw you walk by earlier, and we just wanted to say you have a beautiful family." Tim thanked them, but Jeannie seemed quiet. The boys smiled, proud after hearing they were beautiful, especially after enjoying a nice dinner of stuffed flounder and boiled shrimp. They watched the sunset again as the lights on the oil rigs and ships lit up and the stars appeared. The moon was already up, shining silver, not orange, when night fell. They all cuddled on the rocking love seat, and soon the boys fell asleep. But when it was time to put them in bed, both wanted Jeannie to sleep with them. So Tim brought her nightgown and changed into his shorts, and they switched bedrooms. Jeannie lay between the boys, holding them close, and cried quietly for a few minutes. Tim admired how fast the boys had come to love Jeannie. It felt like it was almost time to make an important call. The Kellys arrived in 2 cars at 10, with the Hildebrands and Allens coming at 10:30. Tim noticed how well Joe and Kathy were getting along as they sat close together in the back seat. Once everyone was set for the beach, Tim asked Nate, Linda, Jan, and Gary to take Jeannie and the boys down to the beach and set up while he and the parents would join them in a bit. They looked a bit confused, but agreed. Tim then asked his family to stay behind for some advice. He explained how quickly Jeannie and the boys were connecting. Mark even called her Mommy the night before, and both boys wanted to sleep with her. He thought it would be wise to invite Jeannie's parents for a visit to see this bond for themselves. They talked about it for a while, and then Tim's mother suggested she and Amelia should invite them. They did, and the parents quickly accepted. Jeannie was surprised when Tim told her, and felt a bit nervous as they awaited their arrival later that afternoon. Karen's mom was a bit unhappy when they first got there, but after a few hours, her jealousy went away. She saw how much her grandsons loved and relied on Jeannie instead. They all spent time together. They shared meals, had fun at the beach, went shopping for souvenirs, and took lots of pictures. They walked around the ship at night and looked at the stars. This made everyone feel closer to each other. The boys thrived in the warmth of family love. On Saturday night, the 3 younger couples went to a club. They had some beer and danced. Nate, Gary, and Tim kept the college boys away. The girls felt special thanks to the attention from strangers. Nate and Gary were excited to get back home, hoping for a fun night. Tim was already planning on the way back. When they got home, he grabbed some towels, his keys, and Jeannie. He drove down the beach to a quiet spot he knew. Jeannie asked, "Where are we going?" He said, "Somewhere private." Jeannie reminded him that they had the house to themselves since the boys were with their grandparents. Tim replied, "Yes, but I have something planned and it's better if they don't hear us." They arrived at a dark house and parked the truck. They watched the waves under the moonlight. A deputy drove by and joked, asking if they had heard any strange sounds. They hadn't. He suggested they might feel safer a mile further where it was quiet. They thanked him and drove a little farther south to swim in the moonlit water. 2 miles down, some campers thought they heard a wild animal at 3 in the morning, but they zipped up their tents and went back to sleep. Tim felt that their last date had been amazing, but tonight would be even better. The next day, they all went to the Trinity by the Sea Episcopal Church for the morning service. It was good for everyone. Afterward, they had breakfast at a cafe and finished packing. They said their goodbyes. Karen's parents thanked everyone for including them. Grandma whispered to Tim, "Jeannie is a great girl. She loves the boys, and I can see they love her too. I know Karen would want you to have help with them. I hope things go well for you two." Tim hugged them, as did the boys. Then they drove away. "What did she say?" Tim's mom asked. Tim replied, "She said Jeannie is lovely and that she loves the boys." Jeannie tilted her head and asked, "Really? They were nice, but I thought they might be upset." Tim's mom assured her, "As long as you care for Patrick and Mark, they will be happy with you, and they love their grandsons very much." Jeannie then smiled at Tim and said, "It's easy to love the boys, but their dad can be a handful." Nate, noticing the boys were with their parents, asked Jeannie with a grin, "So, how was your ride in the moonlight? Did you hear any wild animals?" Jeannie blushed, and the adults laughed. Tim hugged her, and then Patrick asked, "Are there really wild animals at the beach at night?" Nate answered, "Yes, I think I heard one. It sounded just like the one we heard at the ranch." Then Patrick joined in. "Who would win, a wild animal or a shark?" Nate replied, "In the water, the shark would win, but on land, I bet the wild animal would win." Patrick was excited. "Daddy, is the wild animal like a big pretty cat?" Nate said, "Yes, it's like a big kitty." Mark asked, "Is it dangerous?" Nate nodded. "It can make loud sounds, so it might be dangerous." Linda tried to help by saying, "We should be careful, but it's also funny." They all laughed, including Jeannie, who was smiling and giggling. Joe said, "Well, now that we've embarrassed my kitten, I guess it's time to go home." "When are you coming home, kitten?" Jeannie joked back, "Maybe never." Everyone laughed at their playful banter. Tim hugged Jeannie close, laughing and holding her tight. She smiled widely, remembering the fun they had the night before. At the ranch, Nate pulled her away from Tim, hugged her tightly, lifted her off the ground, spun her around, and said, "It's just because I love you, sis." They all shared hugs and agreed it was a great time. They wanted to do it again before football season started. Jeannie, Tim, and the boys waved goodbye as they stood on the dune. "Can we stay just one more day?" Jeannie asked hopefully. "Already taken care of," Tim replied. "We can stay one more day and night at Port Aransas." After 3 more days at the ranch, Jeannie went back to her parents' home in San Antonio. Tim and his sons drove to Austin in their rented house, but he was eager to find a permanent one. The next morning, Tim was up early, ready to make some changes in their life before focusing on the upcoming football season. He took the boys to the Happy Lions Learning Center, which was their daycare last year and would be this year. Miss Beverly was happy to see them, just as they were to see her and their friends. After watching the joyful greetings, Tim got serious about finding a home to buy instead of just talking to the realtor who was helping him sell his current house. Tim asked around. He knew many people in the area who had good ideas about what was available. He decided to start at the administration building, known for gossip. He first met with the superintendent, who welcomed him warmly. After their talk, he asked the secretary if she knew of any nice, affordable houses for sale near the school. She suggested calling a builder she knew who was fixing up old houses. It was Daryl Cunningham, whom Tim also knew. Tim found his number in the phone book and called. Daryl was in his office and said he had just the place for him. They agreed to meet in 30 minutes. After greeting each other warmly, Daryl explained that the house he was showing used to belong to an older couple who had to move to Dallas for health reasons. They sold it for a good price, which allowed Daryl to get a great deal today. He started fixing it up by removing the old carpets and polishing the wooden floors. There was still much to do, like updating the electrical and plumbing, repainting the walls, and putting a new roof on. The stone walls were in great shape, and the house was well insulated for that time, with rock covering concrete blocks and thick paneling in the living and dining rooms. The yard also looked good, with trimmed trees and healthy grass. Tim explained he couldn't buy any house until his current one sold, but Daryl offered to help with financing for up to 6 months. Making double mortgage payments would be tough. Tim then called the realtor who was selling his house. She sounded excited and said she had someone interested. She asked if he could meet her at his house. When the realtor arrived, she brought a young couple with her. She introduced them as her niece and her niece's husband, asking if they could look around. Tim agreed but warned them that the house hadn't been cleaned in over a month. They didn't mind and instantly loved the place, making a full-price offer right away. Having already signed papers with the realtor, Tim accepted their offer. They wanted to move in 3 weeks from Monday, so he knew he had to act fast. He called Daryl to set up a meeting. When he arrived, Daryl and his son Dale were on the roof checking the worn shingles. After shaking hands and chatting about the upcoming football season, Daryl said he couldn't sell the house to him just yet, but he would offer it for what he paid plus 10% and the repairs he had done. "It's a great deal for a well-built house on 11 shaded acres," he said with excitement. Daryl continued, "One day the other 10 acres will be worth a lot." Tim joked, "I hope you don't want me to pay $1 million for it. I'd be $750,000 short." Daryl laughed and offered to take the $250,000 Tim mentioned, allowing him to handle the rest of the repairs. "I'm a bit stretched for cash now," he admitted. "But with your help, I can work on my bigger deals and maybe become a millionaire quickly." They spent the next hour and a half going over the house carefully. Dale made a list of things to fix that Tim wanted. When they finished, Daryl gave Tim an estimated cost he could afford, and they shook hands on it. Daryl said his workers were busy for today and tomorrow, so he would send a plumber and electrician soon to start on the important repairs. Since no realtor was involved, they agreed to use a standard sales contract and a lawyer they knew who had a title company. The survey of the property was fresh, ensuring everything would be all right. If there were any issues, they could use the same surveyor at a low cost. Daryl and Dale left, and Tim walked outside to see what he needed for the big yard, bushes and trees. He wanted to check all 11 acres, but thought it would be better to wear his boots and jeans first. After changing, he got in his truck and drove to a small grocery store about a mile away. He bought a 6-pack of Lone Star beer. When he woke up that morning, he had one house. 8 hours later, he had sold it and bought a new house with 11 acres. He wanted to share this news with someone special. That someone was Jeannie. He returned to his old house, opened a beer, and, noticing the irony, called her. He enjoyed a beer while they talked for over an hour. The long-distance call cost a lot, but he didn't mind. Hearing her voice made him feel energized. Meanwhile, the boys were getting ready to leave when he arrived. Since it was still early, he took them to see their new house. The idea of a new home excited them, and they all talked at once about it. They loved the big yard and many trees, but Mark asked why the house was a bit messy and why there wasn't any furniture. Tim explained their furniture was coming later after some work on the house, so they were staying in a motel until it was ready. The boys liked the motel because it had a nice swimming pool. Tim took them to daycare at 8 the next morning and spent the day changing over the utilities and phone services to the new house. He also updated the mail address and removed Karen from the bank accounts. He was in charge of her estate, so he had the death certificate letters and other needed documents. There was so much to do, it felt overwhelming. Luckily, the life insurance had paid off, and Tim decided that the money should go to her sons, so he set up trust funds for each of them for $100,000. He put $10,000 in savings for each boy and gave the rest, $80,000, to Danny, a friend in Round Rock, who was a good investment advisor. Danny made smart choices that helped a lot in the future. He bought $1,000 of shares in popular tech companies like Apple and Microsoft, and another $1,000 in shares of Walmart, which were cheaper. Danny also bought some strong stocks but put most of the money in real estate near Lake Travis. Tim appreciated Danny's advice so much that he took $15,000 from his cattle account and gave it to Danny, telling him to use it wisely. Normally, Tim would buy more cattle with that money, but 25 years later, that decision to invest had really helped his retirement check. While he was outside talking with the plumbers and electricians, Jeannie drove up in her new 1980 Jeep Grand Wagoneer that her dad gave her. The car was striking, white with wood paneling, and had a powerful engine. But the real reason everyone paused their work was Jeannie herself. She stepped out wearing sandals and short shorts, her red and white checked blouse off one shoulder, looking sun-kissed and radiant. Seeing her made everyone in the area stop and stare. She walked to Tim, gave him a friendly kiss on the cheek, greeted the workers, and asked for a tour of the house. She admired the beautiful woodwork, the banisters, the fireplace, and the spacious living and dining areas. She also liked the large bedrooms and closets. However, she wasn't thrilled with the kitchen layout or the bathrooms, but she absolutely loved the yard and the 10 acres of woods around the house. After her visit, Tim called Daryl's office and asked him to come over when he could. Daryl arrived just after lunch, and Tim suggested they explore the house again, this time with Jeannie. Daryl smiled and said, "Let's go, Miss Jeannie." With wide eyes, she pulled Tim aside. "I didn't mean to cause extra work, Tim. You asked for my thoughts, and I shared them. If you like things the way they are, you can leave them alone. This isn't my house." Tim smiled, took her arm, and brought her back to Daryl. Just before Daryl took them off, Jeannie felt a flutter in her heart. The cost of the changes she suggested would offset some savings Tim made by choosing a metal roof instead of replacing the cedar shakes. Daryl had a roofing crew needing work, and they made a good deal that helped everyone. The metal roof would be safer and hold up better in storms, plus it was cheaper to put on and keep maintained. The plumber and electrician finished the original work and started on the new bathroom and kitchen projects. They measured everything and gave Tim a sheet filled with drawings and measurements. "Let's go shopping for appliances," Tim suggested with a grin. Jeannie looked thoughtful and repeated that those were just her ideas based on her taste, so he shouldn't feel like he had to spend money on things he liked. He just smiled and said, "Let's go. I need to pick up the boys at 5. They headed to the appliance store Daryl recommended, closer to Austin. Tim was glad he brought her along. He didn't know what colors or styles to choose, so he let her take the lead with the saleswoman. "Okay, but don't say I didn't warn you," she said with a frown. She meant it as if he cared about the colors and styles, but he really didn't. He knew she had much better taste than him. The boys were really happy to see Jeannie. They wanted to tell her all about what happened since they last saw her. Mark felt annoyed because Patrick was talking too much. He took Jeannie's face in his hands and turned her to him, ready to share what he had been up to. Tim laughed, but Jeannie managed the situation like a pro, letting both boys talk to her. Before they left her Jeep in the garage at the new house, she grabbed her small travel case to take with them to the motel. She wasn't sure what they had planned, but she wanted to be ready for anything. After a fun swim, they went to a cozy little restaurant across the street for dinner, then headed back to the room to get ready for bed. Jeannie read Winnie the Pooh to them, changing the 100-acre wood to 10-acre wood, just like their new home. She tucked them in, kissed each of them goodnight, and got ready to drive home. But Tim said it was too late for her to drive, so she called her mom and spent the night in bed with Mark. Patrick stayed with his dad. Tim gave her a sweet goodnight kiss, making it a bit harder for her to fall asleep in the same room with him. The next morning, they took the boys to daycare. After breakfast and playtime at McDonald's, Jeannie and Tim went shopping for bathroom items. Jeannie suggested custom tile showers and granite countertops. They picked out toilets, sinks, bathtubs, and faucets for the bathrooms. Then Tim decided to stop at the nearest Sears. He already had a push mower, a weed eater, and other tools for the yard, but he knew he needed a riding mower for the big area of grass. He bought a Craftsman with ramps to load it in his truck. Jeannie didn't get a say in that, but she didn't care much about the kitchen appliances either. Over the next 2 days, Jeannie moved from the passenger seat to the middle next to Tim. He kept his hand on her leg when he could. She felt happy and settled, even if it was too soon to be open about their relationship. In her mind, they were already a couple planning their future together. Time passed quickly. Jeannie moved into her new apartment with help from Tim and his boys. Coaching school began, and the boys stayed with Karen's parents for 5 days. The new coaching staff was set, with people Tim trusted. He kept some of the old staff and added 2 excellent coaches. The coaching school focused on learning new skills and working as a team. They went to talks and clinics and returned to a conference room at the hotel for lunch. Tim taught them offensive plays they would use from 7th grade to varsity levels. After a break, his friend Bill Owens, a great coach, trained them in defensive techniques they would use at every level. At 5:30, they gathered in the hotel bar for drinks, games, and conversation. By the end of the coaching school, everyone agreed on coaching ideas, how to treat kids, and the details of offense and defense. They had built friendships that mattered for the busy football season in Texas. Being a single dad and head coach was tough. Tim had talked to the school leaders when they offered him the job. They were confident he would manage well, but he wasn't so sure, especially with the season coming closer. Jeannie also had her teaching and dance team duties, which kept her busy during practice and games. Tim needed help, and soon people offered their support. Miss Beverly said she would take care of the boys until he finished practice if he let them have dinner with her family. Sharon and her sister also offered to babysit when needed, especially on game nights. Even the grandparents and other family members were eager to help, taking the boys to games and staying until Tim was free on Saturdays. Jeannie did her best to keep the boys happy. She often picked them up and took them home, made them meals, and helped them get ready for bed if Tim wasn't there. They all grew closer, even though it wasn't perfect. Despite the challenges, they had the most successful football season in 20 years. Their only loss came from a last-minute field goal by the district champions, which kept them out of the playoffs. But those champions went on to win the state title, so they felt proud, especially since they had 18 starters returning, with 9 on each side of the ball. Looking ahead, things seemed bright. The junior varsity, sophomore, and freshman teams won their district, losing only 2 games, while the junior high teams went undefeated. Jeannie's dance team also did well, finishing in the top 5 at state. They had a few sleepovers, but kept things respectful. Jeannie loved the new house and joined the boys in asking for a swimming pool for next summer, teasing Tim privately that she had some lovely bikinis he hadn't seen yet. What if he had a pool surrounded by trees? The trees were careful, but they were not hiding anything. Tim and Jeannie spent a lot of time together at his house. They shared looks at school, and how she acted with the boys showed that they were more than just friends. One moment that really stood out was when Mark, feeling sleepy at a game, called her Mommy and rested his head on her shoulder. Everyone nearby couldn't help but react with surprise. This made Jeannie feel really happy, sometimes so much that tears would come to her eyes. No one said anything directly, but everyone accepted them as a couple. Most thought they got close after losing their spouses. However, some knew about the poker game drama and Blizzard's issues. They were happy Tim and Jeannie found comfort in each other's pain, especially when invitations to parties were sent out. Tim and Jeannie would each get an invitation, and they would always end up together. Tim tried hard to keep his feelings hidden, but when he asked her to marry him in front of her parents on Christmas Eve, it surprised no one, not Jeannie or the boys either. Tim called his family to share the news, and Nate jokingly said, "Oh, you finally got around to that. We thought it was settled months ago." "Oh, right. Football season," Tim replied. "Well, brother, we have some news. You're going to be an uncle." Jan took the phone next and added, "Twice over. Gary and I are having a girl, and so are Nate and Linda. Port Aransas worked wonders, so keep next March open." Their wedding took place in early June at a shed on the ranch. Many friends came, both local and from their school, even though it was 200 miles away. Father Jose, a local priest, led the traditional ceremony, which included all the usual words about love, honor, and being true to each other until death. Tim and Jeannie said their vows loudly and clearly, not backing down from their promises. Their first kiss as a married couple was a lovely mix of love and joy, even if it was in front of a crowd. They went on a honeymoon to a quiet spot in the Caribbean and came back with golden tans. 9 months later, they had a baby girl with blonde hair, and they named her Gina Marie. Their little boys adored her from the moment she was born, and they vowed to protect her fiercely for life. Over the next few years, another boy and girl joined their happy family. Tim never got the soundproofing he wanted for the walls, but he did get it for the master bedroom. Jeannie learned to use pillows to quiet her sounds when the children were home. When they weren't there, she relied on the trees around the house to keep the noise down. But their closest neighbors always knew when they were home alone, and they used that knowledge for their own fun. Jeannie got the kitchen appliances and bathroom she wanted. The boys stayed close by while their mom enjoyed the swimming pool. Tim finally had the top-notch security system he had wished for. They all agreed that this was their best decision yet. Hey listeners, if you enjoyed watching this video and want to stay updated with our latest content, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss out on what's coming next. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video with Queen Cheating Tales.